There is a particular weight you carry that doesn't show up on resumes, medical charts, or personality tests. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly in the way you listen, in the way you hesitate before trusting optimism, in the way you understand, without needing it explained, that the world can change overnight. Your story is often summarized with numbers, birth rates, census data, headlines about the largest generation, but that isn't where it actually begins. Your story begins before you were old enough to remember anything at all, with people who came home from places most of us can't imagine and decided, almost stubbornly, to build something gentle in a world that had been anything but. Your parents didn't return from the Second World War looking for fulfillment or self-expression. They came back carrying images they would never fully explain. They had seen what happens when systems collapse, when cruelty is organized, when human life becomes expendable. Many of them had already lost their childhoods to the Great Depression before they ever put on a uniform. Hunger and fear were familiar companions long before victory parades. So when they came home, they didn't romanticize struggle. They didn't believe suffering made people better. They believed it made people tired. And they were determined that you would not grow up tired before your time. That's why the small things mattered so much. A stable job, a modest house, a refrigerator that hummed reliably through the night, a television glowing softly in the living room, a neighborhood where children could wander and doors stayed unlocked. These weren't luxuries, they were declarations, proof that chaos had been held at bay, at least for now. The GI Bill wasn't just policy, it was possibility. It turned paperwork into education, education into home ownership, and home ownership into something resembling peace. Fresh lumber and poured concrete became more than construction materials. They became walls against memory, against loss, against the fear that everything could be taken again. You grew up breathing that in, not privilege exactly, but protection, the sense that someone had already paid a price so you wouldn't have to start from zero. And then, every morning, you stepped outside. When the screen door slammed shut behind you, something remarkable happened. You were free. Not supervised freedom, real freedom. The kind that trusted you to exist in the world without constant explanation or monitoring. You didn't have a schedule, you had daylight. You didn't have a phone, you had directions shouted from one yard to another. You didn't have GPS, you had landmarks, the big oak tree, the cracked sidewalk, the house with the loud dog.
But here's what people often misunderstand when they talk about that freedom. You weren't unaccountable. You were never invisible. Someone was always watching, not in a sinister way, but in a communal one. Mrs. Henderson on her porch, Mr. Lewis trimming his hedges, the retired couple who knew everyone's name and business without ever seeming intrusive. They didn't need permission to correct you. They didn't hesitate. They understood something we've mostly forgotten, that children don't just belong to families, they belong to communities. When you crossed a line, it was addressed immediately, not escalated, not documented, addressed. A voice, firm and certain, explaining exactly what you'd done and why it mattered. And you listened, because that authority didn't come from anger, it came from shared standards. Respect wasn't negotiable or contextual. It didn't depend on whether you liked the adult or agreed with them. Older meant responsible. Responsible meant deserving of your attention. Your reputation followed you. You couldn't curate a separate version of yourself for different spaces. Who you were at home was who you were at the corner store, at school, on the block. Character wasn't an internal identity, it was a public record. That didn't make you anxious, it made you steady. It taught you that integrity isn't about being perfect, it's about being consistent. And then there was the playground. By today's standards, it was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Bare metal, hard surfaces, heights that required commitment, no warning labels, no one explaining risk in advance. You learned by doing, and sometimes by falling. That slide wasn't warm, it was scorching. The merry-go-round wasn't gentle, it was merciless. The giant stride didn't forgive weak grip strength or bad timing. Physics wasn't abstract, it was immediate. You didn't learn courage because someone told you to be brave. You learned it because you wanted the ride badly enough to accept the consequences. You learned limits by exceeding them. You learned resilience by discovering that pain, while unpleasant, was survivable. Nobody rushed in to reinterpret failure as success. If you fell, you got up. If you bled, you checked whether it was serious, and if it wasn't, you tried again. Those playgrounds taught you something essential, that your body could adapt, that fear didn't always deserve obedience, and that the world would not soften itself to spare your feelings. The vacant lot taught you something else. Creation wasn't abstract, it required materials, improvisation, and mistakes. You didn't order solutions, you scavenged them. Bent nails, warped boards, borrowed tools. Your first attempts were terrible. The roof leaked, the walls leaned, the whole thing might collapse if someone climbed too fast. And still, you learned. You learned that failure wasn't personal, it was instructional. You learned that things don't arrive complete. They're built, adjusted, reinforced, rebuilt. That lesson stayed with you longer than the fort ever did. And sometimes, despite all effort, you still lost. You didn't make the team. You didn't get the part. You weren't chosen. The rejection wasn't softened with explanations about potential or hidden talent. It landed cleanly. You felt it fully. No one intervened to protect your self-esteem. They trusted something deeper, your ability to recover. You discovered that disappointment doesn't end life. It simply becomes part of it. That embarrassment fades, that tomorrow still arrives, that you can carry regret without letting it define you. That quiet confidence you have now didn't come from praise, it came from survival, from learning early that you are stronger than a bad outcome. And all the while, the world was changing. You heard it first, a sound that didn't belong to your parents' generation, something raw and restless coming through the radio. Elvis didn't just sing differently, he moved differently, and that unsettled people. You noticed how quickly authority felt threatened by youth expressing itself without permission. You learned that cultural change always scares someone. Then came the Beatles, louder, longer hair, a global moment where adults realized they were no longer the center of the future. You watched institutions struggle to maintain control as something new surged past them. You learned that change doesn't ask to be approved. But not all change came with music. Sometimes it came with sirens. You learned early how to crouch under a desk and wait, how to practice for an ending no one could prevent. Nuclear war wasn't hypothetical, it was rehearsed. And yet you carried on. Homework, dinner, bedtime. You learned how to live alongside fear without letting it paralyze you. Then October 1962 arrived, and fear stepped out of rehearsal. For days, the adults were quiet. You noticed it immediately. The tension, the radio always on, the glances exchanged when they thought you weren't paying attention. You learned something crucial during those 13 days, that the people you rely on don't always know how things will turn out. Sometimes they're just choosing composure over panic. When it passed, you didn't forget, you adjusted. And then came November 1963. You remember where you were. Everyone does. That was the day innocence lost its abstraction. Leadership was no longer permanent. Protection wasn't guaranteed. And still, life continued, until it shattered again and again. By the time Robert Kennedy was killed, you understood something that shaped you permanently. That hope is not fragile because it is weak, but because it is precious. You watched heroes fall. You watched movements fracture. You watched your country grieve, rage, burn, and rebuild in cycles that didn't offer neat conclusions. And still, people showed up. Still, they marched. Still, they believed something better was worth pursuing, even without certainty. That is not naive optimism. It is earned resilience. You learned that safety is not promised. It is constructed, maintained, repaired. You learned that progress is real, but never guaranteed. That adulthood doesn't mean invulnerability. That courage often looks like routine in the face of uncertainty. And that lesson stayed with you. You don't romanticize the past. You remember it honestly. You know what was lost and what was gained. You know that the world didn't protect you, but it taught you. You learned how to stand up, how to fail, how to keep going when certainty disappears. That's not nostalgia. That's wisdom, and it's yours.